The light, still absent, seemed to me to shine in the words of the canticle, mystic, scented lily that opened among the arches of the vaults. I thank thee, O Lord, for this moment of ineffable joy. I prayed silently, and said to my heart, foolish heart, what do you fear? Suddenly some noises were heard from the direction of the north door. I wondered why the servants, preparing for their work, disturbed the sacred functions in this way. At that moment 3 swineherds came in, terror on their faces. They went to the abbot and whispered something to him. The abbot first calmed them with a gesture, as if he did not want to interrupt the office, but other servants entered, and the shouts became louder. A man, a dead man, some were saying. And others, a monk. You saw the sandals? Prayers stopped, and the abbot rushed out, motioning the cellarer to follow him. William went after them, but by now the other monks were also leaving air stalls and hurrying outside. The sky was now light, and the snow on the ground made the compound even more luminous. Behind the choir, in front of the pens, where the day before had stood the great jar with the pig's blood, a strange object, almost cruciform, protruded above the edge of the vessel, as if 2 stakes had been driven into the ground, to be covered with rags for scaring off birds. But they were human legs, the legs of a man thrust head down into the vessel of blood. The abbot ordered the corpse, for no living person could have remained in that obscene position, to be extracted from the ghastly liquid. The hesitant swineherds approached the edge and, staining themselves with blood, drew out the poor, bloody thing. As had been explained to me, the blood, having been properly stirred immediately after it was shed, and then left out in the cold, had not clotted, but the layer covering the corpse was now beginning to solidify. It soaked the habit, made the face unrecognizable. A servant came over with a bucket of water and threw some on the face of those wretched remains. Another bent down with a cloth to wipe the features. And before our eyes appeared the white face of Venantius of Salmec, the Greek scholar with whom we had talked that afternoon by Adelmo's codices. The abbot came over. Brother William, as you see, something is afoot in this abbey, something that demands all your wisdom. But I beseech you, act quickly. Was he present in choir during the office? William asked, pointing to the corpse. No, the abbot said. I saw his stall was empty. No one else was absent? It did not seem so. I noticed nothing. William hesitated before asking the next question, and he did so in a whisper, taking care that the others could not hear. Berengar was in his stall? The abbot looked at him with uneasy amazement, as if to signify that he was struck to see my master harbor a suspicion that he himself had briefly harbored, for more comprehensible reasons. He said then rapidly, he was there. He sits in the first row, almost at my right hand. Naturally, William said, all this means nothing. I don't believe anyone entering the choir passed behind the apse, and therefore the corpse could have been here for several hours, at least since the time when everyone had gone to bed. To be sure, the first servants rise at dawn, and that is why they discovered him only now. William bent over the corpse, as if he were used to dealing with dead bodies. He dipped the cloth lying nearby into the water of the bucket and further cleansed Venantius's face. Meanwhile, the other monks crowded around, frightened, forming a talkative circle on which the abbot imposed silence. Among the others, now making his way forward, came Severinus, who saw to matters of physical health in the abbey, and he bent down next to my master. To hear their dialogue, and to help William, who needed a new clean cloth soaked in the water, I joined them, overcoming my terror and my revulsion. Have you ever seen a drowned man? William asked. Many times, Severinus said. And if I guess what you imply, they do not have this face. The features are swollen. Then the man was already dead when someone threw the body into the jar. Why would he have done that? Why would he have killed him? We are dealing with the work of a twisted mind. But now we must see whether there are wounds or bruises on the body. I suggest it be carried to the balneary, stripped, washed, and examined. I will join you there at once. And while Severinus, receiving permission from the abbot, was having the body carried away by the swineherds, my master asked that the monks be told to return to the choir by the path they had taken before, and that the servants retire in the same way, so the ground would remain deserted. Thus we remained alone, beside the vessel, from which blood had spilled during the macabre operation of the body's recovery. The snow all around was red, melting in several puddles where the water had been thrown, and there was a great dark stain where the corpse had been stretched out. A fine mess, William said, nodding toward the complex pattern of footprints left all around by the monks and the servants. Snow, dear Adza, is an admirable parchment on which men's bodies leave very legible writing. But this palimpsest is badly scraped and perhaps we will read nothing interesting on it. Between here and the church there has been a great bustle of monks, between here and the barn and the stables the servants have moved in droves. The only intact space is between the barns and the edificium. Let us see if we can find something of interest. What do you expect to find? I asked. If he didn't throw himself into the vessel on his own, someone carried him there, already dead, I imagine. And a man carrying another man's body leaves deep tracks in snow. So look and see if you find around here some prints that seem different to you from the prints of those noisy monks who have ruined our parchment for us. And we did. And I will say immediately that I was the one, God preserve me from all vanity, who discovered something between the jar and the edificium. They were human footprints, fairly deep, in a zone where no one had yet passed, and, as my master remarked at once, fainter than those left by the monks and the servants, a sign that more snow had fallen and thus they had been made some time before. But what seemed to us most noteworthy was that among those prints there was a more continuous trail, as of something dragged by the one leaving the prints. In short, a spoor that went from the jar to the door of the refectory, on the side of the edificium between the south tower and the east tower. Refectory, scriptorium, library, William said. Once again, the library. Venantius died in the edificium, and most probably in the library. And why in the library exactly? I am trying to put myself in the murderer's place. If Venantius had died, been killed, in the refectory, in the kitchen, or in the scriptorium, why not leave him there? But if he died in the library, then he had to be carried elsewhere, both because in the library the body would never have been discovered, and perhaps the murderer was particularly interested in its being discovered, and because the murderer probably does not want attention to be concentrated on the library. And why should the murderer be interested in the bodies being discovered? I don't know. I can suggest some hypotheses. How do we know that the murderer killed Venantius because he hated Venantius? He could have killed him rather than another, to leave a sign, to signify something else. Omnis mundi creatura, quasi fiber et scriptura. I murmured. But what would that sign be? This is what I do not know. But let us not forget that there are also signs that seem such and are instead without meaning, like blittery or bu bob bath. It would be atrocious, I said, to kill a man in order to say bu bob bath. It would be atrocious, William remarked, to kill a man even to say, credo in unum diem. At that moment Severinus joined us. The corpse had been washed and examined carefully. No wound, no bruise on the head. Do you have poisons in your laboratory? William asked, as we headed for the infirmary. Among the other things. But that depends on what you mean by poison. There are substances that in small doses are healthful and in excessive doses cause death. Like every good herbalist I keep them, and I use them with discretion. In my garden I grow, for example, valerian. A few drops in an infusion of other herbs calms the heart if it is beating irregularly. An exaggerated dose brings on drowsiness and death. And you noticed no signs of any particular poison on the corpse? None. But many poisons leave no trace. We had reached the infirmary. Venantius's body, washed in the balneary, had been brought there and was lying on the great table in Severinus's laboratory. Alembics and other instruments of glass and earthenware made me think of an alchemist's shop, though I knew of such things only by indirect accounts. On some long shelves against the wall by the door was arrayed a vast series of cruets, ampoules, jugs, pots, filled with substances of different colors. A fine collection of simples, William said. All products of your garden? No, Severinus said. Many substances, rare or impossible to grow in this climate, have been brought to me over the years by monks arriving from every part of the world. I have many precious things that cannot be found readily, along with substances easily obtained from the local flora. You see, a galling pesto comes from Cathay. I received it from a learned Arab. Indian aloe, excellent cicatrizant. Live Aryan revives the dead, or, rather, wakes those who have lost their senses. Arseniaco. Very dangerous, a mortal poison for anyone who swallows it. Borage, a plant good for ailing lungs. Betony, good for fractures of the head. Mastic. Calms pulmonary fluxions and troublesome catarrhs. Myrrh, the gift of the Magi? I asked. The same, but now used to prevent miscarriage, gathered from a tree called Balsamodendron myrrha. And this is mumia, very rare, produced by the decomposition of mummified cadavers. It is used in the preparation of many almost miraculous medicines. Mandragora officinalis, good for sleep. And to stir desires of the flesh, my master remarked. So they say, but here it is not used for that purpose, as you can imagine. Severinus smiled. And look at this, he said, taking down an ampoule. Tutty, miraculous for the eyes. And what is this? William asked in a bright voice, touching a stone lying on a shelf. That? It was given to me some time ago. It apparently has therapeutic virtues, but I have not yet discovered what they are. Do you know it? Yes, William said, but not as a medicine. He took from his habit a little knife and slowly held it toward the stone. As the knife, moved by his hand with extreme delicacy, came close to the stone, I saw that the blade made an abrupt movement, as if William had shifted his wrist, which was, however, absolutely still. And the blade stuck to the stone, making a faint metallic sound. You see, William said to me, it attracts iron. And what is its use? I asked. It has various uses, of which I will tell you. But for the present I would like to know, Severinus, if there is anything here that could kill a man. Severinus reflected a moment, too long, I would have said, considering the clarity of his answer. Many things. As I said, the line between poison and medicine is very fine. The Greeks used the word pharmakon for both. And there is nothing that has been removed recently? Severinus reflected again, then, as if weighing his words, nothing recently. And in the past? Who knows? I don't recall. I have been in this abbey 30 years, and 25 in the infirmary. Too long for a human memory, William admitted. Then, abruptly, he said, we were speaking yesterday of plants that can induce visions. Which ones are they? Severinus's actions and the expression on his face indicated an intense desire to avoid that subject. I would have to think, you know. I have so many miraculous substances here. But let us speak, rather, of Venantius's death. What do you say about it? I would have to think, William answered. Prime. In which Benno of Uppsala confides certain things, others are confided by Berengar of Arundel, and Adza learns the meaning of true penitence. The horrible event had upset the life of the community. The confusion caused by the discovery of the corpse had interrupted the holy office. The abbot promptly sent the monks back to the choir, to pray for the soul of their brother. The monks' voices were broken. William and I chose to sit in a position allowing us to steady their faces when the liturgy did not require cowls to be lowered. Immediately we saw Berengar's face. Pale, drawn, glistening with sweat. Next to him we noticed Malachi. Dark, frowning, impassive. Beside Malachi, equally impassive, was the face of the blind Jorge. We observe, on the other hand, the nervous movements of Benno of Uppsala, the rhetoric scholar we had met the previous day in the scriptorium, and we caught his rapid glance at Malachi. Benno is nervous, Berengar is frightened, William remarked. They must be questioned right away. Why? I asked ingenuously. Ours is a hard task, William said. A hard task, that of the inquisitor, who must strike the weakest and at their moment of greatest weakness. In fact, as soon as the office was over, we caught up with Benno, who was heading for the library. The young man seemed vexed at hearing William call him, and he muttered some faint pretext about work to be done. He seemed in a hurry to get to the scriptorium. But my master reminded him that he was carrying out an inquiry at the abbot's behest, and led Benno into the cloister. We sat on the inner wall, between two columns. Looking from time to time toward the edificium, Benno waited for William to speak. Well, then, William asked, what was said that day when you were discussing Adelmo's marginalia with Berengar, Venantius, Malachi, and Jorge? You heard it yesterday. Jorge was saying that it is not licit to use ridiculous images to decorate books that contain the truth. And Venantius observed that Aristotle himself had spoken of witticisms and plays on words as instruments better to reveal the truth, and hence laughter could not be such a bad thing if it could become a vehicle of the truth. Jorge said that, as far as he could recall, Aristotle had spoken of these things in his Poetics when discussing metaphor. And these were in themselves two disturbing circumstances, first because the book of the Poetics, unknown to the Christian world for such a long time, which was perhaps by divine decree, had come to us through the infidel Moors, but it was translated into Latin by a friend of the angelic doctor of Aquino, William said. That's what I said to him, Benno replied, immediately hardened. I read Greek badly and I could study that great book only, in fact, through the translation of William of Morbik. Yes, that's what I said. But Jorge added that the second cause for uneasiness is that in the book the Stagirite was speaking of poetry, which is infima doctrina and which exists on figments. And Venantius said that the Psalms, too, are works of poetry and use metaphors, and Jorge became enraged because he said the Psalms are works of divine inspiration and use metaphors to convey the truth, while the works of the pagan poets use metaphors to convey falsehood and for purposes of mere pleasure, a remark that greatly offended me. Why? Because I am a student of rhetoric, and I read many pagan poets, and I know, or I believe that their words have conveyed also truths natural or Christian. In short, at that point, if I recall correctly, Venantius spoke of other books and Jorge became very angry. Which books? Benno hesitated. I don't remember. What does it matter which books were spoken of? It matters a great deal, because here we are trying to understand what has happened among men who live among books, with books, from books, and so their words on books are also important. It's true, Benno said, smiling for the first time, his face growing almost radiant. We live for books. A sweet mission this world dominated by disorder and decay. Perhaps, then, you will understand what happened on that occasion. Venantius, who knew Greek very well, said that Aristotle had dedicated the second book of the Poetics specifically to laughter, and that if a philosopher of such greatness had devoted a whole book to laughter, then laughter must be important. Jorge said that many fathers had devoted entire books to sin, which is an important thing, but evil, and Venantius said that as far as he knew, Aristotle had spoken of laughter as something good and an instrument of truth. And then Jorge asked him contemptuously whether by any chance he had read this book of Aristotle. And Venantius said that no one could have read it, because it has never been found and is perhaps lost forever. And, in fact, William of Morbik never had it in his hands. Then Jorge said that if it had not been found, this was because it had never been written, because Providence did not want futile things glorified. I wanted to calm everyone's spirit, because Jorge is easily angered and Venantius was speaking deliberately to provoke him, and so I said that in the part of the Poetics that we do know, and in the rhetoric, there are to be found many wise observations on witty riddles, and Venantius agreed with me. Now, with us was Pacificus of Tivoli, who knows the pagan poets very well, and he said that when it comes to these witty riddles, no one surpasses the African poets. He quoted, in fact, the riddle of the fish, of Symphocius. Est domus in terris, clara quae voce resultat. Ipsa domus resonate, Tacitus sed non sonat hospice. Ambo tamen current, hospice simul et domus una. At this point Jorge said that Jesus had urged our speech to be yes or no, for anything further came from the evil one. and that to mention fish it was enough to say, fish, without concealing the notion underlying sounds. And he added that it did not seem to him wise to take the Africans as models. And then something happened that I didn't understand. Berengar began to laugh. Jorge reproached him, and he said he was laughing because it had occurred to him that if one sought carefully among the Africans, quite different riddles would be found, and not so easy as the one about the fish. Malachi, who was present, came furious, took Berengar by the cowl, and sent him off to his tasks. Berengar, you know, is his assistant. And after that, Jorge put an end to the argument by going away. We all went off to our occupations, but as I was working, I saw first Venantius, then Adelmo approach Berengar and ask him something. From the distance I saw he was parrying their questions, but in the course of the day both went back to him. And then that evening I saw Berengar and Adelmo confabulating in the cloister before entering the refectory. That's all I know. You know, in fact, that the two persons who have recently died in mysterious circumstances had asked something of Berengar, William said. Benno answered uncomfortably, I didn't say that. I told you what happened that day, because you asked me. He reflected a moment, then hastily added, but if you want to know my opinion, Berengar spoke to them of something in the library, and that is where you should search. Why do you think of the library? What did Berengar mean about seeking among the Africans? Didn't he mean that the African poets should be more widely read? Perhaps, so it seemed. But then why should Malachi have become furious? After all, he's the one who decides whether or not a volume of African poets is given out to be read. But I know one thing. Anyone leafing through the catalogue of books will often find, among the collocations that only the librarian understands, one that says, Africa, and I have even found one that said, Finis Africae, the end of Africa. Once I asked for a book that bore that indication, I can't recall which book, though the title had aroused my curiosity, and Malachi told me the books with that indication had been lost. This is what I know. And this is why I say you're right, check on Berengar, and check when he goes up into the library. You never can tell, William concluded, dismissing him. Then he began strolling with me in the cloister and remarked that, first of all, Berengar had once again been the subject of his brother's murmuring. Second, Benno seemed eager to direct us to the library. I observed that perhaps he wanted us to discover there things he, too, wanted to know, and William said this was probably the case, but it was also possible that in directing us toward the library he wanted to keep us away from some other place. Which? I asked. And William said he did not know, perhaps the scriptorium, perhaps the kitchen, or the choir, or the dormitory, or the infirmary. I remarked that the previous day it was he, William, who had been fascinated by the library, and his answer was that he wanted to be fascinated by the things he chose and not as others advised him. But the library should be kept under observation, he went on, and at this point it would not be a bad idea to try to get into it somehow. Circumstances now authorized his curiosity, within the bounds of politeness and respect for the customs and laws of the abbey. We left the cloister. Servants and novices were coming from the church after Mass. And as we walked along the west side of the church, we glimpsed Berengar coming out of the transept door and crossing the cemetery toward the edificium. William called him, he stopped, and we overtook him. He was even more distraught than when we had seen him inquire, and William obviously decided to exploit, as he had with Benno, this state of his spirit. So it seems that you were the last to see Adelmo alive, he said. Berengar staggered, as if he were about to fall in a faint. He asked in a weak voice. William had dropped his question as if by chance, perhaps because Benno had told him of seeing the two conferring in the cloister after Vespers. But it must have struck home, and clearly Berengar was thinking of another, really final meeting, because he began to speak in a halting voice. How can you say that? I saw him before going off to bed, like everyone else. Then William decided it might be worthwhile to press him without respite. No, you saw him again, and you know more things than you wish to admit. But there are two deaths involved here, and you can no longer be silent. You know very well there are many ways to make a person speak. William had often said to me that, even when he had been an inquisitor, he had always avoided torture. But Berengar misunderstood him, or William wanted to be misunderstood. In any case, the move was effective. Yes, Berengar said, bursting into a flood of tears. I saw Adelmo that evening, but I saw him already dead. How? William asked. At the foot of the hill? No, I saw him here in the cemetery. He was moving among the graves, a ghost among ghosts. I met him and realized at once that I did not have a living man before me. His face was a corpse's, his eyes already beheld the eternal punishment. Naturally, it was only the next morning, when I learned of his death, that I understood I had encountered his ghost, but even at that moment I realized I was having a vision and that there was a damned soul before me, one of the Lemures. Oh, Lord, what a grave-like voice he had as he spoke to me. And what did he say? I am damned. That is what he said to me. As you see me here, you see one returned from hell, and to hell I must go back. So he said to me. And I cried to him, Adelmo, have you really come from hell? What are the pains of hell like? And I was trembling, because I had just left the office of Compline where I had heard read the terrible pages on the wrath of the Lord. And he said to me, the pains of hell are infinitely greater than our tongue can say. You see, he said, this cape of sophisms in which I have been dressed till today? It oppresses me and weighs on me as if I had the highest tower of Paris or the mountain of the world on my back, and never more shall I be able to set it down. And this pain was given me by divine justice for my vainglory, for having believed my body a place of pleasures, and for having thought to know more than others, and for having enjoyed monstrous things, which, cherished in my imagination, have produced far more monstrous things within my soul. And now I must live with them in eternity. You see the lining of this cloak? It is as if it were all coals and ardent fire, and it is the fire that burns my body, and this punishment is given me for the dishonest sin of the flesh, whose vice I knew and cultivated, and this fire now unceasingly blazes and burns me. Give me your hand, my beautiful master, he said to me further, that my meeting with you may be a useful lesson, in exchange for many of the lessons you gave me. Your hand, my beautiful master. And he shook the finger of his burning hand, and on my hand there fell a little drop of his sweat, and it seemed to pierce my hand. For many days I bore the sign, only I hid it from all. Then he disappeared among the graves, and the next morning I learned that his body, which had so terrified me, was now dead at the foot of the cliff. Berengar was breathless, weeping. William asked him, and why did he call you his beautiful master? You were the same age. Had you perhaps taught him something? Berengar hid his head, pulling his cowl over his face, and sank to his knees, embracing William's legs. I don't know why he addressed me like that. I never taught him anything. And he burst into sobs. I am afraid, father. I want to confess myself to you. Have mercy, a devil is devouring my bowels. William thrust him away and held out a hand to draw him to his feet. No, Berengar, he said to him, do not ask me to confess you. Do not seal my lips by opening yours. What I want to know from you, you will tell me in another way. And if you will not tell me, I will discover it on my own. Ask me for mercy, if you like, but do not ask silence of me. Too many are silent in this abbey. Tell me, rather, how you saw his pale face if it was darkest night, how he could burn your hand if it was a night of rain and hail and snow, and what you were doing in the cemetery. Come, and he shook him brutally by the shoulders, tell me this at least. Berengar was trembling in every limb. I don't know what I was doing in the cemetery, I don't remember, I don't know how I saw his face, perhaps I had a light. No, he had a light, he was carrying a light, perhaps I saw his face in the light of the flame. How could he carry a light if it was raining and snowing? It was after Compline, immediately after Compline, it was not snowing yet, the snow began later. I remember that the first flurries began as I was fleeing, toward the dormitory. I was fleeing toward the dormitory as the ghost went in the opposite direction. And after that I know nothing more, please, question me no further if you will not confess me. Very well, William said, go now, into the choir, go to speak with the Lord, since you will not speak with men, or go and find a monk who will hear your confession, because if you have not confessed your sins since then, you have approached the sacraments sacrilegiously. Go, we shall see each other again. Berengar ran off and vanished. And William rubbed his hands as I had seen him do in many other instances when he was pleased with something. Good, he said, now many things become clear. Clear, master? I asked him. Clear now that we also have Adelmo's ghost? My dear Adza, William said, that ghost does not seem very ghostly to me, and in any case he was reciting a page I have already read in some book conceived for the use of preachers. These monks read perhaps too much, and when they are excited they relive visions they learned from books. I don't know whether Adelmo really said those things or whether Berengar simply heard them because he needed to hear them. The fact remains that this story confirms a series of my suppositions. For example, Adelmo died a suicide, and Berengar's story tells us that, before dying, he went around in the grip of a great agitation and in remorse for some act he had committed. He was agitated and frightened about his sin because someone had frightened him, and perhaps had told him the very episode of the infernal apparition that he recited to Berengar with such hallucinated mastery. And he was going through the cemetery because he was leaving the choir, where he had confided, or confessed, to someone who had filled him with terror and remorse. And from the cemetery he was heading, as Berengar informed us, in the opposite direction from the dormitory. Toward the edificium, then, but also, it is possible, toward the outside wall behind the stables, from where I have deduced he must have thrown himself into the chasm. And he threw himself down before the storm came. He died at the foot of the wall, and only later did the landslide carry his corpse between the north tower and the eastern one. But what about the drop of burning sweat? It was already part of the story he heard and repeated, or that Berengar imagined, in his agitation and his remorse. Because there is, as antistrophe to Adelmo's remorse, a remorse of Berengar's. You heard it. And if Adelmo came from the choir, he was perhaps carrying a taper, and the drop on his friend's hand was only a drop of wax. But Berengar felt it burn much deeper because Adelmo surely called him his master. A sign, then, that Adelmo was reproaching him for having taught him something that now caused him to despair unto death. And Berengar knows it. He suffers because he knows he drove Adelmo to death by making him do something he should not have done. And it is not difficult to imagine what, my poor Adza, after what we have heard about our assistant librarian. I believe I understand what happened between the two, I said, embarrassed by my own wisdom, but don't all of us believe in a God of mercy? Adelmo, you say, had probably confessed. Why did he seek to punish his first sin with a sin surely greater still, or at least of equal gravity? Because someone said words of desperation to him. As I said, a page of a modern preacher must have prompted someone to repeat the words that frightened Adelmo and with which Adelmo frightened Berengar. In these last few years, as never before, to stimulate piety and terror and fervor in the populace, and obedience to human and divine law, preachers have used distressing words, macabre threats. Never before, as in our days, amid processions of flagellants, were sacred lauds heard inspired by the sorrows of Christ and of the Virgin, never has there been such insistence as there is today on strengthening the faith of the simple through the depiction of infernal torments. Perhaps it is the need for penitence, I said. Adza, I have never heard so many calls to penitence as today, in a period when, by now, neither preachers nor bishops nor even my brothers the spirituals are any longer capable of inspiring true repentance. But the third age, the angelic pope, the chapter of Perugia. I said, bewildered. Nostalgia. The great age of penitence is over, and for this reason even the general chapter of the order can speak of penitence. There was, 100, 200 years ago, a great wind of renewal. There was a time when those who spoke of it were burned, saint or heretic as they may have been. Now all speak of it. In a certain sense even the Pope discusses it. Don't trust renewals of the human race when curias and courts speak of them. But Fra Dolcino, I ventured, curious to know more about that name I had heard uttered several times the day before. He died, and died dreadfully, as he lived, because he also came too late. And, anyway, what do you know of him? Nothing. That is why I ask you. I would prefer never to speak of him. I have had to deal with some of the so-called apostles, and I have observed them closely. A sad story. It would upset you. In any case, it upset me, and you would be all the more upset by my inability to judge. It's the story of a man who did insane things because he put into practice what many saints had preached. At a certain point I could no longer understand whose fault it was. I was as if dazed by an air of kinship that wafted over the two opposing camps, of saints who preached penitence and sinners who put it into practice, often at the expense of others. But I was speaking of something else. Or perhaps not. I was speaking really of this. When the epoch of penitence was over, for penitence the need for penance became a need for death. And they who killed the crazed penitents, repaying death with death, to defeat true penitence, which produced death, replaced the penitence of the soul with a penitence of the imagination, a summons to supernatural visions of suffering and blood, calling them the mirror of true penitence. A mirror that brings to life, for the imagination of the simple and sometimes even of the learned, the torments of hell. So that, it is said, no one shall sin. They hope to keep souls from sin through fear, and trust to replace rebellion with fear. But won't they truly sin then? I asked anxiously. It depends on what you mean by sinning, Adza, my master said. I would not like to be unjust toward the people of this country where I have been living for some years, but it seems to me typical of the scant virtue of the Italian peoples to abstain from sin out of their fear of some idol, though they may give it the name of a saint. They are more afraid of Saint Sebastian or Saint Anthony than of Christ. If you wish to keep a place clean here, to prevent anyone from pissing on it, which the Italians do as freely as dogs do, you paint on it an image of Saint Anthony with a wooden tip, and this will drive away those about to piss. So the Italians, thanks to their preachers, risk returning to the ancient superstitions, and they no longer believe in the resurrection of the flesh, but have only a great fear of bodily injuries and misfortunes, and therefore they are more afraid of Saint Anthony than of Christ. But Berengar isn't Italian, I pointed out. It makes no difference. I am speaking of the atmosphere that the church and the preaching orders have spread over this peninsula, and which from here spreads everywhere. And it reaches even a venerable abbey of learned monks, like these. But if only they didn't sin, I insisted, because I was prepared to be satisfied with this alone. If this abbey were a speculum mundi, you would already have the answer. But is it? I asked. In order for there to be a mirror of the world, it is necessary that the world have a form, concluded William, who was too much of a philosopher for my adolescent mind. Terce. In which the visitors witness a brawl among vulgar persons. Imaro of Alessandria makes some allusions, and Adza meditates on saintliness and on the dung of the devil. Subsequently William and Adza go back to the scriptorium. William sees something interesting, has a third conversation on the licitness of laughter, but in the end is unable to look where he wishes. Before climbing up to the scriptorium, we stopped by the kitchen to refresh ourselves, for we had partaken of nothing since rising. I drank a bowl of warm milk and was heartened at once. The great south fireplace was already blazing like a forge while the day's bread baked in the oven. 2 herdsmen were setting down the body of a freshly slaughtered sheep. Among the cooks I saw Salvador, who smiled at me with his wolf's mouth. And I saw that he was taking from a table a scrap of chicken left over from the night before and stealthily passing it to the herdsmen, who hid the food in their sheepskin jerkins with pleased grins. But the chief cook noticed and scolded Salvador. Cellarer, he said, you must look after the goods of the abbey, not squander them. Filii Dei they are, said Salvador. Jesus has said that you do for him what you do for one of these puri. Filthy fraticello, fart of a Minorite, the cook shouted at him. You're not among those louse-bitten friars of yours. Any Morel the abbot's charity will see to the feeding of the children of God. Salvador's face turned grim and he swung around, in a rage. I am not a Minorite friar. I am a monk Sancti Benedicti. Merdra a toy, Bogomil de Merdra. Call Bogomil that whore you screw at night, with your heretic cock, you pig. the cook cried. Salvatore thrust the herdsman through the door and, passing close to us, looked at us, worried. Brother, he said to William, you defend the order that is not mine. Tell him the Fili de Francesco non sunt hereticos. Then he whispered into an ear, Il mentirs, pua, and he spat on the ground. The cook came over and roughly pushed him out, shutting the door after him. Brother, he said to William with respect, I was not speaking ill of your order or of the most holy men who belong to it. I was speaking to that false Minorite and false Benedictine who is neither flesh nor fowl. I know where he came from, William said, conciliatory. But now he is a monk as you are and you owe him fraternal respect. But he sticks his nose in where he has no business only because he is under the cellarer's protection and believes himself the cellarer. He uses the abbey as if it belonged to him, day and night. How at night? William asked. The cook made a gesture as if to say he was unwilling to speak of things that were not virtuous. William questioned him no further and finished drinking his milk. My curiosity was becoming more and more aroused. The meeting with Ubertino, the muttering about the past of Salvatore and his cellarer, the more and more frequent references to the Fraticelli and the heretic Minorites I had heard in those days, my master's reluctance to speak to me about Fra Dolcino. A series of images began to return to my mind. For example, in the course of our journey we had at least twice come upon a procession of flagellants. Once the local populace was looking at them as if they were saints, the other time there was murmuring that these were heretics. And yet they were the same people. They walked in procession 2 by 2, through the streets of the city, only their pudenda covered, as they had gone beyond any sense of shame. Each carried a leather lash in his hand and hit himself on the shoulders till blood came, and they were shedding abundant tears as if they saw with their own eyes the passion of the Savior. In a mournful chant they implored the Lord's mercy and the intercession of the Mother of God. Not only during the day but also at night, with lighted tapers, in the harsh winter, they went in a great throng from church to church, prostrating themselves humbly before the altars, preceded by priests with candles and banners, and they were not only men and women of the populace, but also noble ladies and merchants. And then great acts of penance were to be seen. Those who had stolen gave back their loot, others confessed their crimes. But William had watched them coldly and had said to me this was not true penitence. He spoke then much as he had only a short while ago, this very morning. The period of the great penitential cleansing was finished, and these were the ways preachers now organized the devotion of the mobs, precisely so that they would not succumb to a desire for penance that, in this case, really was heretical and frightened all. But I was unable to understand the difference, if there actually was any. It seemed to me that the difference did not lie in the actions of the one or the other, but in the Church's attitude when she judged this act or that. I remembered the discussion with Ubertino. William had undoubtedly been insinuating, had tried to say to him, that there was little difference between his mystic and orthodox faith and the distorted faith of the heretics. Ubertino had taken offense, as one who saw the difference clearly. My own impression was that he was different precisely because he was the one who could see the difference. William had renounced the duties of inquisitor because he could no longer see it. For this reason he was unable to speak to me of that mysterious Fra Dolcino. But then, obviously, I said to myself, William has lost the assistance of the Lord, who not only teaches how to see the difference, but also invests his elect with this capacity for discrimination. Ubertino and Clare of Montefalco, who was, however, surrounded by sinners, had remained saints precisely because they knew how to discriminate. This and only this is sanctity. But why did William not know how to discriminate? He was such an acute man, and as far as the facts of nature went, he could perceive the slightest discrepancy or the slightest kinship between things. I was immersed in these thoughts, and William was finishing his milk, when we heard someone greet us. It was Aimaro of Alessandria, whom we had met in the scriptorium, and who had struck me by the expression of his face, a perpetual sneer, as if he could never reconcile himself to the fatuousness of all human beings and yet did not attach great importance to this cosmic tragedy. Well, brother William, have you already become accustomed to this den of madmen? It seems to me a place of men admirable in sanctity and learning, William said cautiously. It was, when abbots acted as abbots and librarians as librarians. Now you have seen, up there, and he nodded toward the floor above, that half-dead German with a blind man's eyes, listening devoutly to the ravings of that blind Spaniard with a dead man's eyes. It would seem as though the Antichrist were to arrive every morning. They scrape their parchments, but few new books come in. We are up here, and down below in the city they act. Once our abbeys ruled the world. Today you see the situation. The emperor uses us, sending his friends here to meet his enemies. I know something of your mission. Monks talk and talk. They have nothing else to do. But if he wants to control the affairs of this country, he remains in the city. We are busy gathering grain and raising fowl, and down there they trade lengths of silk for pieces of linen, and pieces of linen for sacks of spices, and all of them for good money. We guard our treasure, but down there they pile up treasures. And also books, more beautiful than ours, too. In the world many new things are happening, to be sure. But why do you think the abbot is to blame? Because he has handed the library over to foreigners and directs the abbey like a citadel erected to defend the library. A Benedictine abbey in this Italian region should be a place where Italians decide Italian questions. What are the Italians doing today, when they no longer have even a pope? They are trafficking and manufacturing, and they are richer than the King of France. So, then, let us do the same. Since we know how to make beautiful books, we should make them for the universities and concern ourselves with what is happening down in the valley. I do not mean with the emperor, with all due respect for your mission, Brother William, but with what the Bolognese or the Florentines are doing. From here we could control the route of pilgrims and merchants who go from Italy to Provence and vice versa. We should open the library to texts in the vernacular, and those who no longer write in Latin will also come up here. But instead we are controlled by a group of foreigners who continue to manage the library as if the good Odo of Cluny were still abbot. But your abbot is Italian, William said. The abbot here counts for nothing, Imaro said, still sneering. In the place of his head he has a bookcase. Wormeton. To spite the Pope he allows the abbey to be invaded by Fraticelli. I mean the heretical ones, brother, those who have abandoned your most holy order, and to please the emperor he invites monks from all the monasteries of the north, as if we did not have fine copyists and men who know Greek and Arabic in our country, and as if in Florence or Pisa there were not sons of merchants, rich and generous, who would gladly enter the order, if the order offered the possibility of enhancing their father's prestige and power. But here indulgence in secular matters is recognized only when the Germans are allowed to. Oh good Lord, strike my tongue, for I am about to say improper things. Do improper things take place in the abbey? William asked absently, pouring himself a bit more milk. A monk is also human, Imaro declared. Then he added, but here they are less human than elsewhere. And what I have said? Remember that I did not say it. Very interesting, William said. And are these your personal opinions, or are there many who think as you do? Many who now mourn the loss of poor Adelmo, but if another had fallen into the abyss, someone who moves about the library more than he should, they would not have been displeased. What do you mean? I have talked too much. Here we talk too much, as you must have noticed already. Here, on the one hand, nobody respects silence anymore. On the other, it is respected too much. Here, instead of talking or remaining silent, we should act. In the golden age of our order, if an abbot did not have the temper of an abbot, a nice goblet of poisoned wine would make way for a successor. I have said these things to you, Brother William, obviously not to gossip about the abbot or other brothers. God save me, fortunately I do not have the nasty habit of gossiping. But I would be displeased if the abbot had asked you to investigate me or some others like Pacificus of Tivoli or Peter of Sant'Albano. We have no say in the affairs of the library. But we would like to have a bit of say. So uncover this nest of serpents, you who have burned so many heretics. I have never burned anyone, William replied sharply. It was just a figure of speech, Imaro confessed with a broad smile. Good hunting, Brother William, but be careful at night. Why not during the day? Because during the day here the body is tended with good herbs, but at night the mind falls ill with bad herbs. Do not believe that Adelmo was pushed into the abyss by someone's hands or that someone's hands put Venantius in the blood. Here someone does not want the monks to decide for themselves where to go, what to do, and what to read. And the powers of hell are employed, or the powers of the necromancers, friends of hell, to derange the minds of the curious. Are you speaking of the father herbalist? Severinus of Sankt Wendel is a good person. Of course, he is also a German, as Malachi is a German. And, having shown once again his aversion to gossip, Imaro went up to work. What did he want to tell us? I asked. Everything and nothing. An abbey is always a place where monks are in conflict among themselves to gain control of the community. At Melk, too, but perhaps as a novice you were not able to realize it. But in your country, gaining control of an abbey means winning a position in which you deal directly with the emperor. In this country, on the other hand, the situation is different. The emperor is far away, even when he comes all the way down to Rome. There is no court, not even the papal court now. There are the cities, as you will have seen. Certainly, and I was impressed by them. A city in Italy is something different from one in my land. It is not only a place to live, it is also a place to decide. The people are always in the square. The city magistrates count far more than the emperor or the pope. The cities are like so many kingdoms, and the kings are the merchants. And their weapon is money. Money, in Italy, has a different function from what it has in your country or in mine. Money circulates everywhere, but much of life elsewhere is still dominated and regulated by the bartering of goods, chickens or sheaves of wheat, or a scythe, or a wagon, and money serves only to procure these goods. In the Italian city, on the contrary, you must have noticed that goods serve to procure money. And even priests, bishops, even religious orders have to take money into account. This is why, naturally, rebellion against power takes the form of a call to poverty. The rebels against power are those denied any connection with money, and so every call to poverty provokes great tension and argument, and the whole city, from bishop to magistrate, considers a personal enemy the one who preaches poverty too much. The inquisitors smell the stink of the devil where someone has reacted to the stink of the devil's dung. And now you can understand also what Imaro is thinking about. A Benedictine abbey, in the golden period of the order, was the place from which shepherds controlled the flock of the faithful. Imaro wants a return to the tradition. Only the life of the flock has changed, and the abbey can return to the tradition, to its glory, to its former power, only if it accepts the new ways of the flock, becoming different itself. And since today the flock here is dominated, not with weapons or the splendor of ritual, but with the control of money, Imaro wants the whole fabric of the abbey, and the library itself, to become a workshop, a factory for making money. And what does this have to do with the crimes, or the crime? I don't know yet, but now I would like to go upstairs. Come. The monks were already at work. Silence reigned in the scriptorium, but it was not the silence that comes from the industrious peace of all hearts. Berengar, who had preceded us by only a short time, received us with embarrassment. The other monks looked up from their work. They knew we were there to discover something about Venantius, and the very direction of their gaze drew our attention to a vacant desk, under a window that opened onto the interior, the central octagon. Although it was a very cold day, the temperature in the scriptorium was rather mild. It was not by chance that it had been situated above the kitchen, whence came adequate heat, especially because the flues of the two ovens below passed inside the columns supporting the two circular staircases in the west and south towers. As for the north tower, on the opposite side of the great room, it had no stair, but a big fireplace that burned and spread a happy warmth. Moreover, the floor had been covered with straw, which muffled our footsteps. In other words, the least heated corner was that of the east tower, and in fact I noticed that, although there were few places left vacant, given the number of monks at work, all of the monks tended to avoid the desks located in that part. When I later realized that the circular staircase of the east tower was the only one that led, not only down to the refectory, but also up to the library, I asked myself whether a shrewd calculation had not regulated the heating of the room so that the monks would be discouraged from investigating that area and the librarian could more easily control the access to the library. Poor Venantius's desk had its back to the great fireplace, and it was probably one of the most desired. At that time I had passed very little of my life in a scriptorium, but I spent a great deal of it subsequently, and I know what torment it is for the scribe, the rubricator, the scholar to spend the long winter hours at his desk, his fingers numb around the stylus, when even in a normal temperature, after 6 hours of writing, the fingers are seized by the terrible monk's cramp and the thumb aches as if it had been trodden on. And this explains why we often find in the margins of a manuscript phrases left by the scribe as testimony to his suffering and his impatience, such as, "Thank God it will soon be dark," or, "Oh, if I had a good glass of wine," or also, "Today it is cold, the light is dim, this vellum is hairy, something is wrong." As an ancient proverb says, 3 fingers hold the pen, but the whole body works and aches. But I was telling about Venantius's desk. It was rather small, like the others set around the octagonal courtyard, since they were meant for scholars, whereas the larger ones under the windows of the outer walls were meant for illuminators and copyists. Venantius also worked with a lectern, because he probably consulted manuscripts on loan to the abbey, of which he made a copy. Under the desk was a low set of shelves piled with unbound sheets, and since they were all in Latin, I deduced they were his most recent translations. They were written hastily and did not represent the pages of a book, for they had yet to be entrusted to a copyist and an illuminator. For this reason they were difficult to read. Among the pages were a few books in Greek. Another Greek book was open on the lectern, the work on which Venantius had been exercising his skill as translator in the past days. At that time I knew no Greek, but my master read the title and said this was by a certain Lucian and was the story of a man turned into an ass. I recalled then a similar fable by Apuleius, which, as a rule, novices were strongly advised against reading. Why was Venantius making this translation? William asked Berengar, who was at our side. The abbey was asked to do it by the Lord of Milan, and the abbey will gain from it a preferential right to the wine production of some farms to the east of here. Berengar pointed with his hand toward the distance. But he promptly added, not that the abbey performs venal tasks for laymen. But the Lord who has given us this commission went to great pains to have this precious Greek manuscript lent us by the Doge of Venice, who received it from the Emperor of Byzantium, and when Venantius had finished his work, we would have made 2 copies, one for the Lord of Milan and one for our library. Which therefore does not disdain to add pagan fables to its collection, William said. The library is testimony to truth and to error, a voice then said behind us. It was Jorge. Once again I was amazed, but I was to be amazed often in the days that followed, by the old man's way of suddenly, unexpectedly appearing, as if we did not see him and he did see us. I wondered also why on earth a blind man was in the scriptorium, but I realized later that Jorge was omnipresent in all corners of the abbey. And often he was in the scriptorium, seated on a stool by the fireplace, and he seemed to follow everything going on in the room. Once I heard him ask from his place, in a loud voice, "Who is going upstairs?" And he turned to Malachi, who was going toward the library, his steps silenced by the straw. The monks all held him in high esteem and often had recourse to him, reading him passages difficult to understand, consulting him for a gloss, or asking counsel on how to depict an animal or a saint. And he would look into the void with his spent eyes, as if staring at pages vivid in his memory, and he would answer that false prophets are dressed like bishops and frogs come from their mouths, or would say what stones were to adorn the walls of the heavenly Jerusalem, or that the Arimaspi should be depicted on maps near the land of Prester John, urging that their monstrosity not be made excessively seductive, for it sufficed to portray them as emblems, recognizable, but not desirable or repellent to the point of laughter. Once I heard him advise a scholiast on how to interpret the recapitulatio in the texts of Tychonius according to the thought of St. Augustine, so that the Donatist heresy could be avoided. Another time I heard him give advice on how, in making commentary, to distinguish heretics from schismatics. Or again, he told a puzzled scholar what book to seek in the library catalog and more or less on what page he would find it listed, assuring him that the librarian would certainly give it to him because it was a work inspired by God. Finally, on another occasion I heard him say that such and such a book should not be sought because, though it did indeed exist in the catalog, it had been ruined by mice 50 years earlier, and by now it would crumble to powder in the fingers of anyone who touched it. He was, in other words, the library's memory and the soul of the scriptorium. At times he admonished monks he heard chatting among themselves, "Hurry, and leave testimony to the truth, for the time is at hand." He was referring to the coming of the Antichrist. The library is testimony to truth and to error, Jorge said. Undoubtedly Apuleius and Lucian were reputed to be magicians, William said. But this fable, beneath the veil of its fictions, contains also a good moral, for it teaches how we pay for our errors, and, furthermore, I believe that the story of the man transformed into an ass refers to the metamorphosis of the soul that falls into sin. That may be, Jorge said. But now I understand why, during that conversation of which I was told yesterday, Venantius was so interested in the problems of comedy. In fact, fables of this sort can also be considered kin to the comedies of the ancients. Both tell not of men who really existed, as tragedies do. On the contrary, as Isidore says, they're fictions. Fabulas poetae effando nominavrunt, quia non sunt res factes sed tantum lacendo fictae. At first I could not understand why William had embarked on this learned discussion, and with a man who seemed to dislike such subjects, but Jorge's reply told me how subtle my master had been. That day we were not discussing comedies, but only the licitness of laughter, Jorge said grimly. I remembered very well that when Venantius had referred to that discussion, only the day before, Jorge had claimed not to remember it. "Ah," William said casually, "I thought you had spoken of poets' lies and shrewd riddles." "We talked about laughter," Jorge said sharply. "The comedies were written by the pagans to move spectators to laughter, and they acted wrongly. Our Lord Jesus never told comedies or fables, but only clear parables which allegorically instruct us on how to win paradise, and so be it." "I wonder," William said, "why you are so opposed to the idea that Jesus may have laughed. I believe laughter is a good medicine, like baths, to treat humors and the other afflictions of the body, melancholy in particular." "Baths are a good thing," Jorge said, "and Aquinas himself advises them for dispelling sadness, which can be a bad passion when it is not addressed to an evil that can be dispelled through boldness. Baths restore the balance of the humors. Laughter shakes the body, distorts the features of the face, makes man similar to the monkey. Monkeys do not laugh. Laughter is proper to man, it is a sign of his rationality," William said. "Speech is also a sign of human rationality, and with speech a man can blaspheme against God. Not everything that is proper to man is necessarily good. He who laughs does not believe in what he laughs at, but neither does he hate it. Therefore, laughing at evil means not preparing oneself to combat it, and laughing at good means denying the power through which good is self-propagating. This is why the rule says, the 10th degree of humility is not to be quick to laughter, as it is written, stultus in risu exaltat vocem suam. Quintilian, my master interrupted, says that laughter is to be repressed in the panegyric, for the sake of dignity, but it is to be encouraged in many other cases. Pliny the Younger wrote, "Sometimes I laugh, I jest, I play, because I am a man." "They were pagans," Jorge replied. "The rule forbids with stern words these trivialities. Scurrilitates vero vel verba odiosa et risum moventia eterna clausura in omnibus locis damnamus, et ad talia eloquia discipulum aperior os non permittimus." But once the word of Christ had triumphed on the earth, Synesius of Cyrene said that the divinity could harmoniously combine comic and tragic, and Aelius Spartianus said of the Emperor Hadrian, man of lofty behavior and of naturaliter Christian spirit, that he could mingle moments of gaiety with moments of gravity. And finally Ausonius recommended moderate use of the serious and the jocose. But Paulinus of Nola and Clement of Alexandria put us on guard against such foolishness, and Sulpicius Severus said that no one ever saw St. Martin in the grip of wrath or in the grip of hilarity. But he recalled some replies of the Saint Spiritualiter Salsa, William said. They were prompt and wise, not ridiculous. Saint Ephraim wrote an exhortation against the laughter of monks, and in the De Habitu et Conversatione Monachorum there is a strong warning to avoid obscenity and witticisms as if they were asp venom. But Hildebrandus said, admittenda tibi ioga sunt post Syria caedum, sed tamen et dignus ipsa gerenda modus. And John of Salisbury authorized a discreet hilarity. And finally Ecclesiastes, whom you quoted in the passage to which your rule refers, where it says that laughter is proper to the fool, permits at least silent laughter, in the serene spirit. The spirit is serene only when it contemplates the truth and takes delight in good achieved, and truth and good are not to be laughed at. This is why Christ did not laugh. Laughter foments doubt. But sometimes it is right to doubt. I cannot see any reason. When you are in doubt, you must turn to an authority, to the words of a father or of a doctor. Then all reason for doubt ceases. You seem to me steeped in debatable doctrines, like those of the logicians of Paris. But Saint Bernard knew well how to intervene against the castrate Abelard, who wanted to submit all problems to the cold, lifeless scrutiny of reason not enlightened by Scripture, pronouncing his it is so and it is not so. Certainly one who accepts dangerous ideas can also appreciate the jesting of the ignorant man who laughs at the sole truth one should know, which has already been said once and for all. With his laughter the fool says in his heart, Deus non est. Venerable Jorge, you seem to me unjust when you call Abelard a castrate, because you know that he incurred that sad condition through the wickedness of others. For his sins, for the pride of his faith in man's reason. So the faith of the simple was mocked, the mysteries of God were eviscerated, or at least this was tried. Fools they who tried, questions concerning the loftiest things were treated recklessly, the fathers were mocked because they had considered that such questions should have been subdued, rather than raised. I do not agree, Venerable Jorge. Of us God demands that we apply our reason to many obscure things about which Scripture has left us free to decide. And when someone suggests you believe in a proposition, you must first examine it to see whether it is acceptable, because our reason was created by God, and whatever pleases our reason can but please divine reason, of which, for that matter, we know only what we infer from the processes of our own reason by analogy and often by negation. Thus, you see, to undermine the false authority of an absurd proposition that offends reason, laughter can sometimes also be a suitable instrument. And laughter serves to confound the wicked and to make their foolishness evident. It is told of St. Maurice that when the pagans put him in boiling water, he complained that the bath was too cold. The pagan governor foolishly put his hand in the water to test it, and burned himself. A fine action of that sainted martyr who ridiculed the enemies of the faith. Jorge sneered. Even in the episodes the preachers tell, there are many old wives' tales. A saint immersed in boiling water suffers for Christ and restrains his cries, he does not play childish tricks on the pagans. You see, William said. This story seems to you offensive to reason and you accuse it of being ridiculous. Though you are controlling your lips, you are tacitly laughing at something, nor do you wish me to take it seriously. You are laughing at laughter, but you are laughing. Jorge made a gesture of irritation. Jesting about laughter, you draw me into idle debate. But you know that Christ did not laugh. I am not sure of that. When he invites the Pharisees to cast the first stone, when he asks whose image is owed the coin to be paid in tribute, when he plays on words and says, Tu es Petrus, I believe he was making witticisms to confound sinners, to keep up the spirits of his disciples. He speaks with wit also when he says to Caiaphas, Thou hast said it. And you well know that in the most heated moment of the conflict between Cluniacs and Cistercians, the former accused the latter, to make them look ridiculous, of not wearing trousers. And in the Speculum Stultorum it is narrated of the ass Brunellus that he wonders what would happen if at night the wind lifted the blankets and the monks saw their own pudenda. The monks gathered around, laughed, and Jorge became infuriated. You are drawing these brothers of mine into a feast of fools. I know that among the Franciscans it is the custom to curry the crowd's favor with nonsense of this kind, but of such tricks I will say to you what is said in a verse I heard from one of your preachers. Tum pedex carmen extulit horrigilum. The reprimand was a bit too strong. William had been impertinent, but now Jorge was accusing him of breaking wind through the mouth. I wondered if this stern reply did not signify, on the part of the elderly monk, an invitation to leave the scriptorium. But I saw William, so meddlesome a moment earlier, now become meek. I beg your pardon, Venerable Jorge, he said. My mouth has betrayed my thoughts. I did not want to show you a lack of respect. Perhaps what you say is correct, and I was mistaken. Jorge, faced by this act of exquisite humility, emitted a grunt that could express either satisfaction or forgiveness, and he could only go back to his seat, while the monks who had gradually collected during the argument scattered to their places. William knelt again at Venantius's desk and resumed searching through the paper. With his humble reply, William had gained a few seconds of quiet. And what he saw in those few seconds inspired his investigation during the night that was to come. But they were really only a few seconds. Benno came over at once, pretending he had forgotten his stylus on the desk when he had approached to hear the conversation with Jorge, and he whispered to William that he had to speak with him urgently, fixing a meeting place behind the balneary. He told William to leave first, and he would join him in a short while. William hesitated a few moments, then called Malachi, who, from his librarian's desk near the catalogue, had followed everything that had happened. William begged him, in view of the injunction received from the abbot, and he heavily emphasized this privilege, to have someone guard Venantius's desk, because William considered it important to his inquiry that no one approach it throughout the day, until he himself could come back. He said this in a loud voice, and so not only committed Malachi to keep watch over the monks, but also set the monks themselves to keep watch over Malachi. The librarian could only consent, and William and I took our leave. As we were crossing the garden and approaching the balneary, which was next to the infirmary building, William observed, Many seem to be afraid I might find something that is on or under Venantius's desk. What can that be? I have the impression that even those who are afraid do not know. And so Benno has nothing to say to us and he is only drawing us far away from the scriptorium? We will soon find out, William said. In fact, a short while later Benno joined us. Sext. In which Benno tells a strange tale from which unedifying things about the life of the abbey are learned. What Benno told us was quite confused. It really seemed that he had drawn us down there only to lure us away from the scriptorium, but it also seemed that, incapable of inventing a plausible pretext, he was telling us fragments of a truth of vaster dimensions than he knew. He admitted he had been reticent that morning, but now, on sober consideration, he felt William should know the whole truth. During the famous conversation about laughter, Berengar had referred to the Finis Africae. What was it? The library was full of secrets, and especially of books that had never been given to the monks to read. Benno had been struck by William's words on the rational scrutiny of propositions. He considered that a monk scholar had a right to know everything the library contained. He uttered words of fire against the Council of Soissons, which had condemned Abelard, and while he spoke we realized that this monk was still young, that he delighted in rhetoric, was stirred by yearnings toward freedom, and was having a hard time accepting the limitations the discipline of the abbey set on his intellectual curiosity. I have earned always to distrust such curiosity, but I know well this attitude did not displease my master, and I saw he was sympathizing with Benno and giving him credence. In short, Benno told us he did not know what secrets Adelmo, Venantius, and Berengar had discussed, but he would not be sorry if as a result of this sad story a bit more light were to be cast on the running of the library, and he hoped that my master, however he might unravel the tangle of the inquiry, would have reason to urge the abbot to relax the intellectual discipline that oppressed the monks, some from far places, like himself, he added, who had come for the express purpose of nourishing the mind on the marvels hidden in the vast womb of the library. I believe Benno was sincere in expecting of the inquiry what he said. Probably, however, as William had foreseen, he wanted at the same time to retain for himself the possibility of rummaging in Venantius's desk first, devoured as he was by curiosity, and in order to keep us away from that desk, he was prepared to give us information in exchange. And here is what it was. Berengar was consumed, as many of the monks now knew, by an insane passion for Adelmo, the same passion whose evils divine wrath had castigated in Sodom and Gomorrah. So Benno expressed himself, perhaps out of regard for my tender years. But anyone who has spent his adolescence in a monastery, even if he has kept himself chaste, often hears talk of such passions, and at times he has to protect himself from the snares of those enslaved by them. Little novice that I was, had I not already received from an aged monk, at Melk, scrolls with verses that as a rule a layman devotes to a woman? The monkish vows keep us far from that sink of vice that is the female body, but often they bring us close to other errors. Can I finally hide from myself the fact that even today my old age is still stirred by the noonday demon when my eyes, happen to linger on the beardless face of a novice, pure and fresh as a maiden's? I say these things not to cast doubt on the choice I made to devote myself to monastic life, but to justify the error of many to whom this holy burden proves heavy. Perhaps to justify Berengar's horrible crime. But, according to Benno, this monk apparently pursued his vice in a yet more ignoble fashion, using the weapon of extortion to obtain from others what virtue and decorum should have advised them against giving. So for some time the monks had been making sarcastic observations on the tender looks Berengar cast at Adelmo, who, it seems, was of great comeliness. Whereas Adelmo, enamored only of his work, from which he seemed to derive his sole pleasure, paid little attention to Berengar's passion. But perhaps, who knows, he was unaware that his spirit, secretly, tended toward the same ignominy. The fact is, Benno said, he had overheard a dialogue between Adelmo and Berengar in which Berengar, referring to a secret Adelmo was asking him to reveal, proposed a vile barter, which even the most innocent reader can imagine. And it seems that from Adelmo's lips Benno heard words of consent, spoken as if with relief.